greatest army of Crusaders was destroyed not by swords, but by the sun, thirst, and smoke. It was not just a military disaster, it was a lesson in how nature and human hubris can become a deadly alliance. In the heat of July 1187, the Knights of the Kingdom of Jerusalem marched toward their doom, confident they were heading for glory. But step by step, the desert itself led them into a trap. Saladin was in no hurry to attack. He waited. He knew that the heat, dust, and lack of water would do most of the work for him. The Crusader army, weighed down by heavy armor and weak discipline, was quickly losing strength. When the water ran out, the sun became their main enemy. Every step became torture, every attempt to catch their breath a desperate gesture. By the time the smoke from the burning grass covered the camp, the Crusaders were no longer an army, just a crowd of exhausted people. Saladin struck at the very moment when the enemy was blinded and suffocating, and what began as a march to victory turned into the collapse of an entire era. Watch the video to the end to find out how, in just 2 days, Saladin destroyed an army that was considered invincible. Why the fate of Jerusalem was decided a few kilometers from a water source, and how pride became the knight's final enemy. I will reveal one of the most important secrets. The Kingdom of Jerusalem fell not only because of external enemies such as Saladin. In fact, internal conflicts that destroyed it from within played a much greater role in its downfall. The political climate in the kingdom was extremely unstable and tense. Disagreements between influential factions, power struggles, and the personal ambitions of the powerful led to the kingdom being on the brink of destruction long before Saladin delivered the decisive blow. External threats only served as a catalyst for processes that were already underway internally. When King Baldwin IV, known for his bravery and leadership qualities, passed away, the kingdom found itself in a difficult position. He left behind a throne occupied by a young and weak heir. Baldwin's nephew, who was supposed to become the new ruler, was not strong enough to cope with the challenges of the time. His reign was short-lived, and soon the throne passed to Guy de Lusignan. This man became king not because of his merits or political authority, but because of his marriage to Baldwin's sister. Guy had neither the charisma nor the willpower to hold such an important position. His coronation was not universally recognized and caused a rift among the nobility from the very beginning. His weakness as a ruler quickly became apparent, which only exacerbated the kingdom's problems. One of Guy's most influential and powerful opponents was Raymond III, Count of Tripoli. Raymond was born and raised in the Holy Land and therefore understood local politics better than anyone else. He was one of the richest and most powerful barons, and unlike Guy, was respected among the other aristocrats. Raymond believed that relations with Saladin should be more pragmatic. He believed in the need for truces that would ensure peace and stability in the region, and was opposed to the idea of open warfare. Raymond considered Guy incapable of handling the situation and therefore underestimated him as a ruler. This led to him and Guy becoming fierce enemies, and a bitter struggle for influence in the kingdom broke out. As a result of this confrontation, two rival factions formed in Jerusalem. One supported the king and the other sided with Raymond. The royal faction supporting Guy consisted mainly of newly arrived European knights seeking glory and wealth. These knights did not understand the complexity of the political situation in the East and viewed Raymond as a coward who was not ready for decisive action. They considered his caution to be weakness and strongly supported aggressive actions, which they were ready to carry out for their own benefit. Among the most prominent representatives of this group were Gerard de Ridford, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, and Renaud de Chatillon, who became one of the most famous and controversial figures of the time. These men had a personal dislike for Raymond and used their king to push him into war with Saladin. Their influence on Guy was significant, and this only worsened the situation in the kingdom. Renaud de Chatillon, in turn, became a key figure in this political conflict. He was the owner of Kerak, a strategically important castle that controlled the caravan routes between Egypt and Syria. This castle was very important for trade and supplies, and Renaud knew this very well. He was known for his reckless bravery and fearlessness in the face of danger. Renaud did not take the truce with Saladin seriously. For him, it was only a temporary obstacle that could be ignored for personal gain. He repeatedly violated the truce by raiding Muslim caravans, and each time he received enormous spoils. However, such actions, of course, had far-reaching consequences. Saladin, who was a strategist and distinguished himself by his political maturity, soon used Renaud's reckless aggression as a pretext for starting a new war. The most destructive of all of Renaud's actions was his attack on a Muslim caravan that was protected by the existing truce. This attack was an insult to Saladin and gave him the necessary excuse to act. As a result of Renaud's violation of the truce, Saladin had a legitimate basis for declaring a holy war on the entire Kingdom of Jerusalem. In his eyes, this was not simply a violation of the treaty, but an insult to all the principles on which his own political course was based. The attack brought enormous spoils, but at the cost of destroying the last hopes for peace and stability in the kingdom. Upon learning of Renaud's attack, Saladin demanded that Guy punish his vassal and return the stolen property. However, Guy found himself in a difficult situation. He was unable or unwilling to punish Renaud, as he was one of his main supporters. This allowed Saladin to further strengthen his position. He swore that he would punish Renaud for his actions and broken oaths, and was prepared to use all his political and military resources to achieve this goal. Meanwhile, Count Raymond, observing the collapse of the situation, decided to conclude a separate truce with Saladin. This was his way of protecting his own territories and preserving his lands from threat. From Raymond's point of view, it was a logical and reasonable step that allowed him to secure his future. However, at the court in Jerusalem, this decision was perceived as treason. Gerard de Ridford, who was on the king's side at the time, actively used this information to turn Guy against Raymond. Soon the kingdom was divided on both sides of this conflict, and the situation reached its climax. It was this internal fragmentation and inability to find common ground between the various factions that were the main reasons why the Crusader army was unable to fight effectively. The division within the kingdom prevented the development of a unified strategy, and ultimately, this played a role in the defeat. King Guy found himself torn between two camps, one that advocated caution and compromise, and another that demanded aggressive action. This internal struggle weakened the kingdom and made it vulnerable. Unlike Jerusalem, Saladin had been skillfully building his relations with the Muslim world for decades. By 1187, he had become the sole ruler of Egypt, Syria, and part of Mesopotamia. He managed to unite all Muslim lands into one powerful army under his command. Saladin understood the importance of unity and was ready to use the differences among his enemies to achieve his goal. While the Kingdom of Jerusalem was fragmented, Saladin was ready to deliver a crushing blow and finally end the threat from the Crusaders. It was the internal conflicts in the Kingdom of Jerusalem that laid the foundation for the coming catastrophe. We would be very interested to hear your opinion. Do you think Jerusalem had a chance of surviving with such a level of internal conflict? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next investigations into great battles. Are you ready to learn the truth about how Saladin's single strategic move led the entire Crusader army to its doom? Saladin understood that his main goal was not to capture castles, but to destroy the kingdom's field army. As long as this army, consisting of the world's best heavy cavalry, remained intact, the kingdom could hold out. But how could he lure it out of its fortified cities with their water sources? Saladin's problem was that the Crusaders rarely engaged in a general battle on unfavorable terms. Their tactic was to sit out in powerful fortresses, such as Sepphoris, where there was water and supplies. A direct assault on such fortresses would be lengthy and cost Saladin enormous losses. He needed to lure the enemy out into the open. Saladin chose the city of Tiberias, located on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, as bait. This choice was not accidental and was a brilliant psychological move. Tiberias was not just another city. It was the capital of the Principality of Galilee, the personal domain of Raymond of Tripoli, King Guy's main opponent. Saladin struck at the very heart of the lands of one of the leaders of the enemy faction. Moreover, Raymond's wife, Countess Asiwa, was in the citadel of Tiberias. By besieging the city, Saladin put Raymond in an unbearable position. If the Count of Tripoli advised the army not to come to the rescue, his enemies would immediately accuse him of cowardice and treason, of being willing to sacrifice his own wife. It was a move that struck at both Raymond's honor and his political weight. For King Guy de Lusignan, the situation was no less complicated. Refusing to defend one of the kingdom's largest cities and rescue the wife of his most powerful vassal would be tantamount to admitting his own weakness. It would show everyone that the king was incapable of protecting his lands. The hawks at his court, eager for battle, would never have forgiven him for such inaction. At the end of June 1187, Saladin's army approached Tiberias and quickly took the city. The citadel, where Countess Eshua had taken refuge with a small garrison, continued to hold out, but its fall was only a matter of time. News of the siege immediately reached Jerusalem, and King Guy ordered the entire army of the kingdom to assemble. The troops converged on Sepphoris, the main gathering point for the Crusaders. The location was perfectly chosen. Sepphoris, or La Sephori, was a powerful fortress located on a hill, but its main advantage was its abundant water sources. The entire army, including thousands of horses, could stay there indefinitely without any supply problems. It was their safe base, their strategic stronghold. Saladin knew the geography of the region very well. He knew that between Sepphoris and Tiberias lay about 25 kilometers of sun-scorched, waterless plateau. Any army that decided to cross this plateau in the heat of July would face serious difficulties. His army, on the other hand, was comfortably located near the Sea of Galilee, with unlimited access to water. Saladin's plan was simple and devilishly effective. He deliberately created a crisis that the Crusader king could not fail to respond to. He had set the bait and now waited for the enemy to leave their safe, water-secured fortress and enter the territory controlled by Saladin. He offered battle on his terms, and the only question was whether the enemy would accept the challenge. Saladin had placed his chess pieces, and now it was King Guy's move. The question was, would they sacrifice their army to save one city? In the next chapter, we will see how reason and pride clashed in the royal tent, and a decision was made that would go down in history as one of the most fateful. What I am about to tell you took place behind closed doors. We reconstruct the very night when a suicidal decision was made that determined the fate of the Holy Land. On the evening of July 2nd, King Guy de Lusignan convened a military council in his tent in Sepphoris. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone understood that the very existence of the kingdom depended on the decision that was made. Raymond of Tripoli was the first to speak. As a man whose lands and wife were under threat, he had every moral right to do so. To the surprise of many, he spoke out strongly against the campaign. He urged the barons not to give in to Saladin's provocation. His arguments were cold and rational, devoid of emotion. Raymond declared that the army assembled in Sepphoris was the kingdom's only shield. To lose this army would mean losing everything. He said he was willing to sacrifice the city of Tiberias and even his own wife to save the kingdom. He understood perfectly well that Saladin would not harm a noble lady, counting on a rich ransom. He pointed out the obvious facts that the hawks preferred to ignore. He reminded them of the waterless plateau between Sepphoris and Tiberias. He emphasized that marching under the July sun would be disastrous for the army even before it encountered the enemy. He begged the king to stay at the springs and force Saladin to attack them from a favorable position or retreat ingloriously when he began to have supply problems. Surprisingly, Raymond's logic worked. His arguments were so convincing that most of the barons, and even King Guy himself, agreed with him. The decision was made to remain in Sepphoris. It seemed that common sense had prevailed, and Saladin's trap had failed. The council was dismissed and the barons dispersed to their tents. However, that was not the end of it. That same night, Gerard de Ridford, the master of the Knights Templar, came to King Guy's tent. He was furious about the decision that had been made. Gerard was a personal enemy of Raymond and considered him a coward. He began to exert intense psychological pressure on the king. The Grand Master of the Knights Templar accused Raymond of cowardice and possible treason. He ridiculed the king, saying that he was unworthy of wearing the crown if he allowed a traitor baron to dictate his will and abandon the besieged city to its fate. He painted a picture of the shame that would fall on the king if he did not dare to take action. Gerard de Ridford also reminded Guy how much he owed to the Knights Templar. He hinted that it was his support that had allowed Guy to ascend the throne against Raymond's wishes. The Grand Master essentially demanded that the king repay his political debt. He declared that if the army did not march, the Templars would consider it a disgrace. The weak-willed King Guy could not withstand this pressure. He feared appearing cowardly in the eyes of the Hawks more than he feared Saladin's army. He yielded to the pressure of one man. That same night, unbeknownst to most of the barons, he overturned the council's decision and gave the order to prepare for departure at dawn. On the morning of July 3rd, when the army received the order to march, many were shocked. Raymond of Tripoli, upon learning of this, reportedly exclaimed that the kingdom was finished, but the order had been given and it could not be disobeyed. The army, clad in heavy armor, left the life-giving springs of Sepphoris and stepped into the scorching, waterless desert. This decision, made by one man under pressure from another, overrode common sense and doomed thousands. It became a perfect example of how personal scores and fear of appearing weak can lead to a grand catastrophe. If you appreciate stories where personal ambitions lead to grandiose consequences, like this video. Guess what happened next? At dawn on July 3rd, the army of Jerusalem, one of the greatest forces ever assembled by the Crusaders, set out on a march that would be a one-way trip. The columns stretched for miles. Heavy cavalry led the way, with infantry in the center guarding the most precious relic of the Christian world. The true cross was carried along with the army. It was the very relic on which, it was believed, the founder of their faith had been crucified. The cross was carried by the Bishop of Acre, and its presence was supposed to inspire the soldiers and guarantee them divine assistance. The soldiers believed that with such a holy relic, they simply could not lose. This confidence was part of their impending downfall. The conditions of the march were monstrous. It was July, the hottest month of the year. The soldiers were dressed in quilted gambesons and heavy chainmail, and the knights wore closed helmets. The black volcanic soil of the plateau was scorching under the sun, and the heat came not only from above, but also from below. The water in the skins they had taken from Sepphoris quickly heated up and began to run out. As soon as Saladin received word that the Crusader army had left Sepphoris and advanced into the waterless plain, his trap snapped shut. He immediately withdrew the bulk of his army from the siege of Tiberias, leaving only a small detachment to blockade the citadel. His main forces moved to cut off the Crusader column, blocking their retreat. Saladin had no intention of engaging in direct combat with heavy knightly cavalry. That would have been too dangerous. Instead, he employed a tactic favored by Eastern armies. He threw his light cavalry, thousands of Turkic and Bedouin mounted archers, at the enemy. They were the ideal weapon for such terrain. The mounted archers swarmed around the slowly creeping column like an angry beehive. They did not approach within striking distance of the lances. Their tactic was to ride up, release a cloud of arrows at the infantry and horses, and immediately retreat before the heavy knights could organize a counterattack. It was an exhausting pursuit. For European knights whose strength lay in a single, powerful battering ram strike, such tactics were a real nightmare. They could not catch up with the light archers. Every attempt to counterattack only tired their horses and disrupted their formation. They were forced to simply move forward, taking damage and unable to retaliate. But their main enemy was not Saladin's army, but thirst. The constant attacks by archers greatly slowed their progress. The march, which was supposed to take one day, dragged on. By noon, the water in their skins was gone. The soldiers, exhausted by the heat, exertion, and dehydration, began to fall. Their mouths were dry and their tongues were swollen. By evening, the army was on the verge of collapse. The infantry, which suffered the most, began to lose discipline. Soldiers threw down their shields and weapons. Their only thought was water. They did not reach Tiberias. The commanders realized that it was impossible to reach the Sea of Galilee before nightfall. The army was forced to stop for the night in a completely dry place, on the slope of a hill with two peaks, known as the Horns of Hattin. They were completely surrounded by Saladin's army. In the distance, Just a few kilometers away, they could see the blue expanse of the Sea of Galilee, but that path was cut off to them. They were trapped without a single drop of water. By evening, the army was broken without ever having engaged in actual combat. They did not reach Tiberias. How were they going to survive the night without a single drop of water? In the next chapter, we will see how Saladin turned their camp into a cauldron of fire. By deciding to spend the night on the slopes of Hattin, the Crusader army signed its own death warrant. It was not a camp, but a temporary resting place of despair. The soldiers and knights collapsed to the ground, completely exhausted from the day's march. They did not even have the strength to set up a proper defensive perimeter. They were trapped, and they all knew it. Saladin wasted no time. His army completely surrounded the hill, occupying all the dominant heights. His warriors, on the other hand, did not suffer from thirst. All night long, caravans of camels brought them water skins filled with fresh water from the Sea of Galilee. They were fresh and full of strength, while their enemies were dying of dehydration. The psychological pressure was unbearable. The Crusaders could see the lights of Saladin's camp in the distance and hear his soldiers celebrating. The Muslim warriors prayed loudly, beat drums, and shouted taunts. They deliberately poured water loudly on the ground to complete the moral humiliation of their surrounded enemy. For people who had not drunk for many hours, these sounds were more terrifying than any weapon. Horses, also suffering from thirst, began to neigh loudly and fight. Chaos grew in the Crusaders' camp. Soldiers and knights spent the night in a state of semi-delirium, their thoughts occupied with only one thing: water. But Saladin had another test in store for them. He ordered his men to set fire to the dry bushes and grass that grew in abundance on the hillsides. Since Saladin's camp was on the windward side, the wind carried thick, acrid smoke straight to the Crusaders' positions. It was a brilliant and cruel tactical move. Now, in addition to the torment of thirst, they were suffocating. The soldiers were choking on the smoke, which stung their eyes and filled their lungs. The heat from the fire added to the already stifling July night. The air became hot and unbreathable. It was hell on earth, created by human hands. The army of Jerusalem did not sleep a wink all night. They sat in the smoke, suffocating, suffering from unbearable thirst and listening to the taunts of the enemy. Their morale was destroyed. All discipline and will to resist evaporated. Even the most hardened veterans realized that this was the end. By dawn on July 4th, all that remained of the great army of Crusaders was a rabble of exhausted men. Their lips were cracked, their eyes red from the smoke, and their bodies completely dehydrated. They could barely hold their weapons in their hands. They were defeated before the battle even began. In the morning, they had only one choice: try to break through to the water or die on that hill. King Guy and the barons gave the order to line up for a last desperate attack, but it was too late. Their army was only a shadow of the force that had left Sepphoris the day before. Saladin had been waiting for this moment. He saw the state of the enemy and knew that victory was in his hands. His soldiers were fresh, well-fed, and most importantly, well-hydrated. They were waiting for the order to finish off an enemy that nature had almost defeated for them. What if I told you that everything the Crusaders believed in collapsed in a single day? By the morning of July 4th, the battle was already lost. When the sun rose, it only exacerbated the suffering of those surrounded. King Guy ordered the infantry to cover the knights as they prepared for a desperate attempt to break through toward the Sea of Galilee. But the infantry, consisting mainly of militiamen, was completely demoralized. A night of thirst, smoke, and fear had broken their will. When they saw Saladin's army closing in, they disobeyed orders. Instead of defending the knights, thousands of infantrymen panicked and fled. They did not run towards the enemy, but up the slope towards the two peaks of the Horns of Hattin. It was a senseless maneuver from a tactical point of view. They were simply looking for any high ground, hoping to find salvation there. By fleeing, they finally destroyed the army. King Guy begged them in vain to return to the ranks, but no one listened to him anymore. Left without infantry cover, the knightly cavalry became an easy target. Heavy cavalry is only strong in a ramming attack. and for this it needs momentum and the support of the infantry. Now they were just a static group of horsemen surrounded on all sides. Saladin's mounted archers immediately took advantage of this, showering them with arrows. In this moment of despair, Raymond of Tripoli, who had been opposed to the march from the beginning, gathered his knights around him. He knew that the army was doomed. He led one last, desperate attack, directing it not toward the water, but toward where he knew troops from his native Tripoli were fighting for Saladin. Something strange happened that still causes controversy among historians. Saladin's troops in that sector, commanded by one of his generals, parted. They seemed to open a corridor, allowing Raymond and his small detachment to break through the encirclement. Whether this was Saladin's order or Raymond's old connections is unknown. Raymond of Tripoli escaped the trap. He did not stop and rode away from the battlefield. He saved his life, but his reputation was destroyed. For the rest of his life, he was haunted by the accusation that he had abandoned his king and army at a crucial moment. He fled to Tyre and from there to Tripoli, where he soon died. The knights remaining on the battlefield, seeing the flight of Raymond and the infantry, rallied around their last stronghold. It was the red tent of King Guy de Lusignan. Next to him was the bishop with the true cross. It was no longer a battle, but agony. The knights, including the king himself, Renaud de Chatillon, and the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Gérard de Riedefort, dismounted. Their horses were either out of action or too weak. They prepared for their final battle, surrounding their king and their most sacred relic. Saladin watched this scene from a nearby hill. He ordered his troops to launch a general attack. Fresh, energetic warriors rushed up the small hill, where a handful of exhausted knights were desperately fighting back. The fate of the battle was decided. It was the end. But how exactly did Saladin achieve his final victory? And what happened to the captured relic? In the next chapter, we will learn about the fall of the true cross. The final stage of the battle unfolded around the Red Royal Tent and the True Cross. For the Crusaders, the loss of this relic would be worse than military defeat. It would mean the loss of divine protection. Therefore, their last forces were thrown into its defense. The knights, standing shoulder to shoulder, formed a living ring around the shrine. Saladin's troops attacked the hill in waves. Saladin's son, Al-Afdal, who witnessed the battle, later recalled this moment. He wrote that the knights fought back with desperate bravery, several times throwing the attackers down the slope. But it was agony, not organized resistance. During one of the attacks, the Bishop of Acre, who was holding the true cross, was struck down. The relic fell to the ground. This caused instant panic among the defenders. They understood that if the cross was captured, their cause would be lost for good. The knights rushed to wrest the shrine from Saladin's approaching warriors. Despite their desperate resistance, the forces were too unequal. Saladin's warriors crushed the defenders. In the chaos of battle, one of the Muslim warriors managed to seize the true cross. The relic, in whose name the Crusades had been launched, was now in Saladin's hands. It was a turning point. The capture of the cross was immediately noticed by both sides. For Saladin's warriors, it was a triumph, confirmation of their righteousness. For the remaining Crusaders, it was a crushing blow. Their morale, already undermined by thirst and fatigue, collapsed completely. Resistance lost all meaning. Saladin himself later ordered the relic to be brought to him. The captured cross, encrusted with gold and precious stones, was displayed to his entire army amid cheers. Some sources report that it was carried across the battlefield upside down, which was the final humiliation for the defeated. With the fall of the relic, the last stronghold of resistance fell. Saladin's son recounted how he watched with delight as his father's warriors finally stormed the royal tent and knocked it down. This signaled the end of the battle. The resistance ceased. King Guy de Lusignan, Renaud de Chatillon, Gérard de Riedefort, and all the surviving barons and knights were taken prisoner. They threw their weapons to the ground. The greatest army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem ceased to exist. The field at Hattin was littered with discarded weapons, armor, and banners. Saladin dismounted from his horse and bowed down to the ground, giving thanks for the victory. It was not just a military success, it was a triumph of his faith in his strategy. He did not just defeat the enemy, he captured their main shrine and their king. The burning of the cross mentioned in the title of our video was, of course, symbolic. Saladin did not burn the relic. He captured it, which was much more important. It meant that divine fortune had turned away from the Crusaders. The victory was complete and unconditional. After the battle, high-ranking prisoners, including King Guy and Renaud de Chatillon, were brought to Saladin's tent. They were covered in dust. Their armor had been removed, and they could barely stand on their feet from thirst and humiliation. The contrast between the victors and the vanquished was striking. Saladin sat surrounded by his emirs, calm and majestic. Saladin showed royal mercy. He saw the condition Guy de Lusignan was in and ordered a bowl of cool water to be brought to him. In Arab culture, offering water to a prisoner meant granting him life. It was a sacred gesture of hospitality that guaranteed safety. King Guy eagerly drank some of the water and then, in accordance with European custom, passed the cup to Renaud de Chatillon, who was standing nearby. This gesture nearly cost the king his life. Saladin reacted immediately, turning to the interpreter. He ordered that it be clearly conveyed to the king that it was he, the king, who had given Renaud the water, not Saladin. The meaning of this was perfectly clear to everyone present. The guarantee of safety provided by the bowl of water applied only to the person to whom it was offered by the host of the tent. Saladin spared the life of King Guy, but he did not spare that of Renaud de Chatillon. The rules of hospitality did not apply to Renaud at that moment. Then Saladin turned to Renaud. He spoke calmly but firmly, listing all his crimes. He reminded him of his broken oaths, of his attack on the caravan during the truce, of his arrogance and cruelty. He reminded him of his own oath to personally punish the oathbreaker. Saladin offered Renaud a choice: convert to Islam or accept his fate. Renaud de Chatillon, true to himself, refused with contempt. He knew what awaited him. For Saladin, fulfilling his oath was a matter of honor, as important as victory in battle. Seeing Renaud's stubbornness, Saladin fulfilled his oath. Renaud de Chatillon was led out of the tent and met his end. He was the only one of the noble prisoners who was executed that day on Saladin's personal orders. It was not an act of cruelty, but an act of justice, as the Sultan himself understood it. King Guy, seeing the fate of his comrade-in-arms, was terrified. He fell to his knees, thinking he would be next. However, Saladin reassured him. He ordered the king to rise, telling him that kings do not kill kings. Guy de Lusignan's life was safe. It was important for Saladin to make this distinction. King Guy was a monarch who waged war, albeit incompetently. Renaud de Chatillon, in his eyes, was a robber and a perjurer who had violated the very foundations of honor. Mercy towards the king and severity towards Renaud were meant to show the whole world Saladin's justice. The captured barons and knights were also spared. A rich ransom awaited them. They were too valuable to be executed. But for one group of prisoners, Saladin had prepared a different, much darker fate. While Saladin showed mercy to the secular barons and King Guy, his attitude toward the orders of knights was completely different. Among the prisoners were several hundred Knights Templar and Hospitallers. These were not just soldiers. They were warrior monks who had sworn to wage eternal war against the infidels. Saladin and his advisors considered the members of these orders to be fanatics. They were the core of the Crusader army, its most professional, motivated, and uncompromising part. Unlike the barons who could make truces and own land, the Templars and Hospitallers existed only for war. From a pragmatic point of view, releasing them for ransom was pointless. They would immediately return to the ranks and continue fighting. They could not be forced to swear an oath not to fight, as their own faith forbade them to do so. Saladin saw them as a threat that had to be eliminated once and for all. After the king and barons had been taken away, Saladin delivered his verdict on the Knights of the Order. Each of them was offered a simple choice: renounce their faith and convert to Islam, thereby saving their lives, or remain true to their vows and accept the consequences. The Knights' decision was almost unanimous. Of the hundreds of captured Templars and Hospitallers, almost none agreed to convert. They were warrior monks to the end. They chose to remain faithful to their vows, knowing full well what that meant. What happened next was not a battle, but a methodical elimination. Saladin ordered all the knights who refused to be led away. The task of carrying out the sentence was entrusted to his soldiers and Sufi mystics who were in the camp. For them, it was a religious act. According to eyewitness accounts, the knights went to their fate with dignity. They supported each other and prayed. By the evening of July 4th, the professional corps of the Jerusalem Kingdom's army no longer existed. It was a deliberate strategic decision. The only high-ranking member of the order whom Saladin spared was the Grand Master of the Knights Templar himself, Gerard de Ridford, the very man who had convinced King Guy to go on this suicidal campaign. Saladin spared his life, hoping to exchange him for the important fortress of Gaza. This decision would later come back to haunt Saladin. Gerard de Ridford would eventually be ransomed and return to lead the Templars, causing many more problems. But at that moment, Saladin probably considered him more valuable as a hostage than as a victim. By destroying the Order's knights, Saladin dealt a blow to the kingdom from which it could not recover. He deprived it not only of soldiers, but of its backbone, its most experienced and ideologically motivated force. Now the way to Jerusalem was open. The consequences of the Battle of Hattin were so devastating that they became a veritable apocalypse for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It was not just a battle that ended in defeat, it was a catastrophe that destroyed all the kingdom's military forces and deprived it of its last chance to resist. The entire army, assembled with enormous effort from all corners of the kingdom, was completely destroyed in a single day, leaving the kingdom defenseless and doomed. King Guy de Lusignan was taken prisoner, which meant not only physical defeat, but also the symbolic collapse of his power. Along with him, almost all the major barons and knights who made up the backbone of the ruling elite were taken prisoner. All the knight monks, such as those who served in the orders of the Templars and Hospitallers, were killed or captured. Thousands of infantrymen were either killed or scattered across deserted territories where they could offer no resistance. As a result, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was left without an army, which meant it was completely powerless in the face of external threats. All the military power that the kingdom had built up over the years disappeared in a matter of hours, and now the kingdom had no one to defend its cities and fortresses. Saladin, meanwhile, did not stop there. He was well aware that the moment of truth had come, and he was not going to waste precious time. His actions were swift and decisive. He dispersed his army throughout the kingdom, and as a result, the cities of the Crusaders began to fall one after another like dominoes. These cities, which at other times could have resisted a siege for a long time, surrendered almost without resistance. Their garrisons had either been killed at Hattin or were now prisoners of Saladin. Ports and coastal cities such as Acre, Jaffa, Sidon, and Beirut literally opened their gates to the Muslim army without offering any resistance. There were practically no defenders left in these cities, and those who remained were no longer able to resist Saladin's forces. The only major city that was still able to resist was Tyre. Here, Raymond of Tripoli, one of the few barons who survived the Battle of Hattin, managed to organize a defense. He was later joined by Conrad of Montferrat, who led the defense of the city. However, this was almost the only example of resistance, and in general, the Kingdom of Jerusalem collapsed under Saladin's attacks. For several months after the Battle of Hattin, the Muslim commander's army stood at the walls of Jerusalem, ready for the final battle. When Saladin's army approached Jerusalem, the city was overflowing with refugees fleeing the advancing threat. However, there were almost no soldiers among these refugees, and the city was virtually defenseless. The only one who remained at his post was Balian of Abelin, one of the few barons who managed to escape capture at Hattin. Balian, realizing the hopelessness of the situation, knew that it would be impossible to hold the city. He had neither the strength nor the means for a full-fledged defense. He was forced to knight dozens of squires and local residents in order to somehow increase the combat effectiveness of the defenders. However, this was only a temporary measure, and Balian understood perfectly well that the city's defense was doomed. After a short siege, Balian d'Ibelin, realizing that the situation had reached a critical point, began negotiations with Saladin. He threatened that if Saladin did not accept an honorable surrender, the defenders of Jerusalem would destroy the Muslim shrines in the city before perishing in a final battle. This threat was a serious step because Balian knew how important the shrines were to Muslims and understood that Saladin would seek to avoid their destruction. Saladin, in turn, did not want to desecrate a city that was so important, not only from a religious, but also from a political point of view. That is why he agreed to honorable terms of surrender in order to avoid unnecessary casualties and destruction. In October 1187, Saladin made a triumphant entry into Jerusalem. His actions in the city were completely different from those taken by the Crusaders almost 90 years earlier. When the Crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099, they carried out a brutal massacre of Muslims and Jews, killing thousands of civilians. In contrast, Saladin strictly forbade his troops from looting and harming the city's inhabitants. The Christian population was allowed to leave the city for a small ransom. Saladin's decision was a striking example of his mercy and political maturity, as well as an indicator of the contrast between his rule and the cruel methods of the Crusaders. Thus, the Battle of Hattin, which was the result of one of the most fateful mistakes made in the tent at Sepphoris, played a decisive role in the fall of Jerusalem. This defeat marked the end of the First Kingdom of Jerusalem and shook the whole of Europe. The catastrophe that followed Hattin was the main reason for the start of the Third Crusade. Saladin's victory not only restored Islamic control over Jerusalem, but also permanently changed the political landscape of the region, leaving a deep mark on history. We can see that the Battle of Hattin was no ordinary battle. It was a brilliant strategic operation in which psychology, geography, and logistics proved more important than steel. Saladin did not simply defeat the enemy army, he forced it to destroy itself. Saladin used his enemies' arrogance and internal strife as weapons. He lured them into a trap from which there was no escape and let the sun and thirst do most of the work for him. It was a triumph of intelligence, patience, and perfect knowledge of the terrain. The fall of Jerusalem was a direct consequence of that one day. This battle forever changed the balance of power in the Middle East, becoming Saladin's greatest victory and the most devastating catastrophe in the history of the Crusades. What other great battles or brilliant commanders would you like to see on our channel? Leave your suggestions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next episodes.